Welcome to the Eye Opener. I'm your host, Michael Lewis. We just celebrated Thanksgiving this past Thursday. However, during this holiday, U.S. President Donald Trump was not idle. It was the first time since voting day that President Trump answered questions from reporters directly. From this press conference, he could see biased reporting from mainstream left-wing media once again. After the press conference, the most common report we saw in the mainstream left-wing media was that President Trump promises to leave the White House if Biden wins after the Electoral College vote on December 14th. If you only look at the left-wing media's report, it appears that President Trump has conceded. When President Trump responded to the reporter's question, it was used by the media to make it look like he was throwing his weight around, thus fulfilling their agenda. But the reality was not so. It was another malicious report taken out of context by mainstream left-wing media. I reviewed the full transcript of that day's press conference, and the fifth person to ask the question caught my attention. This reporter kept asking President Trump the same question with a very specific purpose. After President Trump agreed to let him ask the question, the reporter asked, if the Electoral College votes for Joe Biden on December the 14th, will you concede to Joe Biden? President Trump then replied, it's going to be a very hard thing to concede because we know there was massive fraud. The reporter didn't seem to get the answer he was looking for, so he asked a second time, but will you concede? When he saw that the reporters were going to continue pressing the question, President Trump answered the question in detail, saying, this was a massive fraud. This should never take place in this country. We're like a third world country. He then took Georgia as an example and he said, look at all the mistakes they made. They're doing a recount right now in Georgia that is meaningless. The only recount that matters in Georgia is to take a look at the signatures on the envelope and you will find that those signatures do not match. President Trump then gave another example. He said that in certain states at 3 a.m. and 3:42 a.m. on November 4th, the number of fraudulent votes went up to the ceiling. He then emphasized it's disgraceful and it was a rigged election. Ignoring President Trump's explanation, the reporter asked President Trump for the third time, sir, just to be clear, if the Electoral College votes for Joe Biden, will you concede? President Trump still answered him very patiently. If they do, they made a mistake because this election was a fraud. This reporter persistently asked him for the fourth time, but will you? In a polite manner, President Trump patiently replied once again, I said this election was a fraud. He then gave an example stating, they have Biden beating Obama in areas that mattered in terms of the election in swing states, and yet he's losing to Obama all over the place, but he's beating Obama in swing states, which are the states that matter for purposes of the election. So no, I can't say that at all. Then for the fifth time, the reporter asked President Trump again with only 3 words, you won't concede? Now everyone, keep in mind that this is the fifth time the reporter has asked this question, but he pressed on even further. This time, President Trump started to appear angry, but still sensibly warned the reporter, don't talk to me that way. You're just a lightweight. Don't talk to me that way. I'm the President of the United States. Don't ever talk to the President that way. This reporter still did not give up, but said, sir, I was just asking. In fact, he probably wanted to ask President Trump the same question for the 6th time, but President Trump went right past him and took the question from the next reporter. However, this reporter also began by asking, if the Electoral College does elect President-elect Joe Biden, are you going to leave this building? She basically helped the last reporter to ask for the 6th time. I think anyone else would have lost his temper by now. This kind of questioning is disrespectful to an average person, let alone the President of the United States. But instead of losing his cool, President Trump chose to answer the question in a very cultured way. This time, President Trump said, certainly I will, and you know that. It was a single sentence, which was then widely reported by mainstream media and even shared by foreign media. British media, The Independent, for example, said in an article that Mr. Trump's admission on Thursday that he would leave if Mr. Biden won the Electoral College made headlines worldwide, despite the fact that it should not have been necessary to state. But after saying, certainly I will, President Trump then said something else, which was left out in many articles. He said, but I think that there will be a lot of things happening between now and the 20th of January. A lot of things, massive fraud has been found. President Trump then patiently cited many examples of election fraud. He also went on to say that the media and polls reported that he would even lose Texas to Biden by 4 points. But the result was that President Trump won Texas by about 8 points. In this conversation, we could see at least 3 problems. First, the mainstream media reporters were extremely disrespectful to President Trump. repeatedly asking a question to the current US president as if he's a child. Number two, the question itself was intended to deliberately tease or provoke President Trump so that it can become another attack in their reporting. Third, the same question asked by two different reporters suggests that the left-wing media may have some common goal. This includes the purposeful pursuit of questions of whether or not President Trump is conceding, which is an ill-intentioned, unethical journalistic strategy. On the other hand, President Trump, apart from sensibly warning the reporters on the scene and reasonably asking him to respect the president, has been answering the reporters' questions very earnestly, which shows that he is very respectful and kind. The mainstream media always claims that President Trump is a bully, but in fact, they are actually the bullies, and it's rather disgraceful. And that's not all. These reporters continue with the questions. As you might have noticed, they have their own set of strategies for asking President Trump questions. The questions themselves disregard facts and lack common sense, seemingly not for reporting purposes, but for writing a narrative. Next, a third reporter asked President Trump, if Joe Biden takes over the White House on January 21st, will you announce candidacy for 2024? President Trump replied, no, I don't want to talk about 2024 yet. This reporter repeated the question a second time, only to change the wording and say, then you will run again? Without letting President Trump say half a sentence, the reporter interrupted, asking the same question for the third time. If and when Joe Biden takes over, will you announce candidacy for 2024? President Trump did not directly answer, but said, I and the people that work in this are very professional, and all this stuff, the truth about the election fraud, is coming. The only way Biden got 80 million votes is through a massive fraud. There is no way that he got 80 million votes. Then a fourth reporter immediately asked President Trump, can you give us a timeline of when you're going to present the evidence of voter fraud? Now, everyone, anyone with eyes can see that the evidence is now all over the place, and President Trump's lawyers' lawsuits are public. In fact, these reporters' intent is to find weaknesses in President Trump's words and attack him in their reports, such as President Trump's inability to produce evidence and so on. He said, well, it's happening now. The reporters then asked, when will we see the evidence? President Trump basically said that evidence had already been presented in court and in state legislatures. But the reporters pressed on, if you have the evidence, why don't you bring it now? Other reporters then proceeded to ask similar reckless questions, such as, you know that it's tradition for previous presidents to go to the next president's inauguration. So will you attend Joe Biden's? President Trump said, I don't want to say that yet. But then the reporter followed up saying that, but Biden is going to be inaugurated. President Trump replied, I'll be honest, I know the answer, but I just don't want to say it yet. The reporter still asked, is that a yes? As just mentioned, we can see President Trump's clear stand. First, he did not think that Biden won the election, and the Electoral College should not vote for Biden as well. Second, he did not want to talk about whether he will run for the next president election, nor did he want to comment on whether he will attend Biden's inauguration ceremony. No matter how confident President Trump is, whether he said yes or no, it would be used by those rogue reporters to make up stories. For instance, after the first question, President Trump said, certainly I will, which is now reported all over the world by the leftist media, but they didn't mention whatever was not answered by President Trump. Just imagine if President Trump said he would not go to Biden's inauguration, the left media would say he was breaking the tradition. But if the president says yes, they would make an uproar saying President Trump recognized Biden's being elected. Meanwhile, at the Thanksgiving press conference, President Trump also claimed that he may go to Georgia next Saturday to hold a rally. The rally is to campaign for the two Republican candidates running for the U.S. Senate. They will be vying for the last two seats in the U.S. Senate in a runoff election on January 5th next year, which will ultimately determine whether the Republican Party will become the majority in the Senate. But President Trump will also talk about the current election fraud, especially the outrageous corruption and fraud in Georgia. After the Thanksgiving Day press conference, Twitter also made up fake trending words to undermine Trump's image. This is another kind of authoritarian media practice besides deleting posts, blocking accounts, and putting up fact-check tags. On Thursday night, President Trump pointed out that Twitter's action could even jeopardize national security. He proposed to repeal Section 230. This Section 230 is an umbrella for censorship in U.S. social media. It exempts social media giants from legal liability for what third parties say on their platforms. And these social media platforms can also delete third-party comments for certain reasons without being prosecuted. If this clause was repealed, leftist social media like Twitter would be suspected of breaking the law for its autocratic practice. The fact that President Trump has raised this issue to the level of national security means that repeal is getting closer. In addition, the leftist media are now reporting that at the Thanksgiving press conference, President Trump pointed out that the Chinese Communist Party wanted Biden to win and get rid of his America First policy. President Trump said humorously, "China expressed their wish, please get rid of America First," and the Biden administration said, "That's okay, we'll get rid of America First." On the evening of November 25th, Attorney Powell, as promised, released the Kraken, and 2 lawsuits were filed in a row. Both are available on her personal fundraising website for the legal battle, one for Georgia and the other for Michigan. In Georgia's 100-page lawsuit, Powell lists more than 100 well-founded allegations of election fraud against the state of Georgia. Among other things, on page 9, allegation 14, Powell quotes a sworn witness, a former electronic intelligence analyst with the U.S. 305th Military Intelligence Battalion, who states, "The Dominion software was accessed by agents acting on behalf of the Chinese and Iranian governments in order to monitor and manipulate elections, including the most recent U.S. general election in 2020. The same testimony also mentions that Eric Coomer, a voting software technologist who has proven to be a far-left follower and an active anti-Trump activist, was the first spokesman for the Dominion voting system. The U.S. media outlet National Pulse also reported that Andy Hong, a Chinese-American employee of Dominion's IT core infrastructure, was a former employee of China Telecom and worked on some of its operation in Xiamen, and that he has worked extensively with Cisco, which helped build the Chinese Communist Party's massive network firewall." On November 26, Thanksgiving Day, Attorney Powell again pointed out that the Chinese Communist Party and Iran, among others, used these voting systems to influence the U.S. election. The above testimony proves that the Chinese Communist Party and other adversaries of the United States do have a foot in the U.S. election. Though I say a foot, it is not entirely accurate, because the CCP is all-pervasive and takes advantage of every little gap. The U.S. Natural News reported in July this year that California Governor Gavin Newsom, without the approval of the state legislature, wired $500 million to the Chinese electric car manufacturer, BYD, to purchase N95 masks. And this electric car company does actually sell masks, but up until November 24th, some U.S. media was still discussing this matter, reporting that after the money was wired, there has not been a single mask sent to the California state government, and the $500 million was only half of the total price. And the first remittance, Newsom still needs to pay another $500 million to BYD. As such, Newsom is accused of money laundering through the Chinese Communist Party. Moreover, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, who was recently exposed for spending money on pandemic preparedness supplies from the Chinese Communist Party, has been questioned for allegedly laundering money in the same way, by transferring money to the CCP. This is exactly why attorney Lin Wood, who is assisting President Trump in his lawsuit, is accusing these U.S. governors of conspiring with Communist China to commit corruption. The targets of Powell's lawsuit may very well include these domestic vermin. Powell's lawsuit has recently been likened to the Kraken, a sea monster. So what is the Kraken? Attorney Lin Wood forwarded an article on November 24th titled, "Sidney Powell's Kraken is the Department of Defense Cyber Warfare Program. We are at war." This article points out that the Kraken is actually a reference to the U.S. military project to track and intercept evidence of nefarious activities and crimes by the U.S. deep state, and that President Trump and the U.S. military, along with patriots at the recently established U.S. Space Command, have come into possession of evidence of election fraud and treason by deep government forces. The article cites an interview with Jeffrey Prather, a former U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency official, who pointed out that the U.S. intelligence agencies conducted a real-time surveillance of the Dominion voting system, and that the CIA, FBI, and Department of Homeland Security and the Chinese Communist Party were all found to be involved in election fraud. The article also mentioned President Trump's replacement of the Secretary of Defense and the new acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher C. Miller, who recently requested all U.S. military special operations forces and special intelligence units to report directly to him in order to deal with enemies both inside and outside the United States. Miller's position is consistent with President Trump's. However, there are differing opinions of whether Attorney Powell has direct access to this classified information and intelligence within the military. But there are many who believe that Attorney Powell, along with Attorney Linwood, will use their legal weapons to launch an offensive against the deep state of the United States. In addition, someone tweeted an analysis posting that the Kraken is the U.S. military cyber warfare program, a system used to track evidence of deep government criminality, and that President Trump already has evidence in hand of election fraud in the Air Force, Space Force, parts of the Department of Defense, and the National Security Agency, and with this will soon launch an operation against these American public enemies. It was also mentioned that the recently appointed Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense, Ezra Cohen-Watnick, is a brilliant patriot who is working behind the scenes to save America from corrupt Democrats, deep state government, and foreign enemies like the Chinese Communist Party, and the leftist media cabal, which continues to lie to the American people and cover up evidence of massive election fraud. This is a huge act of treason by the leftist media, which continues to make itself the enemy of the people. He also mentioned that what is happening right now in the United States and the world is a battle between the Great Awakening and the Great Reset, which is currently taking place and will affect the future of the United States and the free world. On November 25th, the English Epoch Times published an editorial piece titled "America's Critical Point in Time." This article indicates that the decades-long communist assault on the United States has reached its climax. It stated that the allegations of massive election fraud implicated that the United States is on the brink of falling into communist abyss. And communism is a specter that seeks to control human beings, not their prosperity. The French poet Charles Baudelaire wrote in 1864, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist." Many communists of the West, socialists, and those who advocate a gradual approach to socialism claim to reject the Soviet and Chinese communist models, but are actually on a path toward a social structure that is no different from the Soviet Union and the CCP. This is the case in most of the Western world. The article concluded with an appeal. We can break through the communist specter's attempt at destruction by actively rejecting its influence and instead follow the divine, restore our traditions, and elevate morality. It is a time of both despair and hope. In 2019, the Washington Post and Forbes published articles successively saying that the Chinese Communist Party is ideologically bankrupt and that it is a vanishing ghost. This, of course, is obviously a lie where people are being boiled like a frog in warm water. The seemingly vanished ghost has been resurrected like a monster in the 2020 election. Due to Western appeasement in the past decades, the communist ideology of the CCP has spread to the heart of the West. In the current US election, communist infiltration has already occurred. Here are 3 examples. The first is the promotion of violence and incitement of hatred. The far left in the United States propagates the slogan, "Break down everything in order to rebuild," which is exactly the same as communist ideology. The second is telling lies as truth and hiding the facts. For example, the New York Times and CNN published headlines after the election saying that there was no fraud. That was a blatant lie. They reported that only a few thousand attended the DC rally on November 14th when millions of people showed up. All of these behaviors are very similar to the CCP. The third example is masking themselves to hide their evil intentions. Here we are referencing the political correctness of the Western leftists. They promote equalization, but actually bring disaster to people. Legalization of drugs, deprivation of legal police powers, restriction on police enforcement, and so on. These are all the steps that are carried out under the glamorous words of progressive and affirmative action. These are, in essence, indulgence of human desires and endless deviation from righteousness and moral standards. While fighting election fraud, President Trump's administration is continuing their fight against the most evil communist regime in existence, the Chinese Communist Party. On November 25th, the U.S. Department of Defense issued a statement dismissing 11 of its Defensive Policy Board advisors, many of whom are familiar to the public as celebrities, including former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright. The Defense Policy Board is a think tank of the U.S. Department of Defense, composed of former senior administration officials and foreign policy experts. The purpose of the board is to provide non-military expertise and maintain the coherence of the Pentagon's foreign policy, which played an important role in decision-making during the Iraq War. Many of the 11 people who were expelled had ties to the Chinese Communist Party. This is especially true for Kissinger. He is considered to be the driving force behind the establishment of diplomatic relations between the US and Communist China. The political forces in Washington, D.C. that he dominates had been pursuing a strategy of embracing the CCP, which is completely at odds with Trump's policy stance. Since 1971, he has made more than 70 visits to China, including 20 private visits in order to facilitate the entry of Western companies into China. After the June 4th Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, he lobbied the US government to lift sanctions against the CCP. The pro-CCP faction in Washington, represented by him, has become a huge delegation in the heart of the CCP in the United States, acting as the eyes and ears of the CCP on trade and human rights, and influencing US decision on CCP. So the Kissingers are also crocodiles in the Washington swamp. And if the Kraken is what it says it is, then this explosion of Kissinger is just the beginning. Many more will follow until the world's evil headquarters, also referred to as the Devil's Cave, is destroyed. In addition to the Chinese Communist Party, there are allegedly other foreign powers involved in the election fraud, including Serbia. In 2012, when Obama was seeking re-election, Biden went to Serbia to meet with local hackers and decided that Dominion's voting system would be controlled by Serbian hackers, according to a National File report and an interview with a whistleblower. So as early as 2012, they were already using Dominion to cheat. On November 27, Iran's chief nuclear weapons expert, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, known as the father of the Iranian bomb, was killed in an attack near Tehran that showed the assailant blowing up Fakhrizadeh's car with a bomb and then shooting at him. The Iran government said it was clearly an assassination. Fakhrizadeh's death must have had a significant impact on Iran's nuclear program. President Trump's administration was still studying the option of bombing the growing stockpile of Iranian nuclear material. And now the death of Iran's chief nuclear weapons expert is practically tantamount to a bombing. So far, there's no suggestion that the assassination had anything to do with the United States. The Iranian side instead is putting the blame for the assassination on Israel, an ally of the United States. In any case, this is enough to send shivers down the spines of the CCP and those in Iran, just like the killing of senior Iranian General Soleimani by the American troops earlier this year. It turns out that the regime, no matter how strong or how rampant the clamor is at this current moment, the one who does evil is only one step away from death. Well, that is it for today, my friends. Make sure to like and share, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.